Good evening, everyone. It is my sincerest pleasure to welcome you to our 7th Fulbright Forum of the 2010 program year. Tonight, we are joined by 2010 junior researcher Joji Kohjima as he presents Hansen's disease in Korean society, social otherization and integration in the 20th century. In his presentation, Joji will explore leprosy in Korean society as a phenomenon that, despite originating at the microscopic level, has extended to the level of social constructs in the discrimination, authorization, and isolation faced by leprosy patients. Joji has conducted research allowing patients to their own stories. He has worked with several institutions, including the Catholic University Medical School's Leprosy Center in Seoul, 518 Memorial Hall at Jeonnam University, and various hospitals in Jeollanamdo. Joji received his bachelor's from the University of Washington with a major in international studies and pre-medicine. His great-grandfather, Robert Manton Wilson, worked as a physician with Hansen's patients in Korea from 1907 to 1941. In the future, Joji hopes to continue studies in medical anthropology in conjunction with medical school. Following tonight's presentation and a brief Q&A session, I hope that you all will join us for a light reception on the 3rd floor. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming 2010 Fulbright Junior Researcher Joji Kohjima.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Shim. I'm just going to start out mentioning some of my affiliations. Of course, Fulbright Korea, without them I wouldn't have the resources to do 10 months of work in Korea. And Seoul University Department of Sociology, Professor Keun-Shik, was kind of my keystone reference in Korea. He really introduced me to basically all of my other references. So without him, I couldn't have done what I did either. So Jeonnam University of Sociology has a current project on oral history of Hansen's disease. They're doing fact-finding reports for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Hansen's disease in Korea. So I was able to kind of tag along with them and visit various hospitals and Grace is here, and institutions and villages in around Korea, and get access to people that I wouldn't otherwise have access to. So that was I had a lot of lucky breaks in my 10-month stint. So for those of you who are starting out, just take chances and see where you end up getting connected to, because it really pays off. I wanted to mention I had a very interesting morning. I was in Hapcheon today, and I was tagging along with a professor, and we were visiting a village of Korean hibakusha, Pipokja, atomic bomb victims. And some of you may know that over 10% of atomic bomb victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were actually Korean. And they were largely forced mobilization laborers that were working in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the factories there, and so a large amount of hibakusha are Korean, and they migrated back and they largely settled in Hapcheon, and they were also isolated in similar ways to Hansen's disease patients, and many people actually thought that they had Hansen's disease because of the deformations that they suffered from the atomic bomb. So from the beginning, I've really tried to look at Hansen's disease as a model for understanding other diseases in Korean society and in the future in other societies as well. That's really my focus, kind of medical ethics and the anthropology of institutions in medicine. So I could talk all day about that, but Hansen's disease, just to mention what Hansen's disease is, it's a bacteria. So it's a bacteria that basically attacks the nervous system. It attacks nerve endings. And what it results in, it attacks autonomic nerves as well as sensory nerves. So it results in feeling in paralysis, well, not paralysis, but lack of feeling in the extremities. And a lot of the deformation that you see, you see the patient at the top has missing fingers and missing toes. And so a lot of the deformations that you see are basically just a side effect of this lack of pain, lack of sensation in the limbs. Other deformations are a side effect of buildup of bacteria in Hansen's bacillus in the skin. So that's the deformations that you see in the face. And you can, so I think it's important to understand that Hansen's disease doesn't actually cause body parts to fall off. It causes, it attacks the nervous system. And when you lose your nerves in any nervous degenerative disorder, you get similar results in the extremities. So these are all the pictures in these slides are mostly taken by my great-grandfather, Robert Menton Wilson, or other missionaries, and ended up in his possession. So these are largely taken at the hospitals, at the hospital at Aeyangwon and Yeosu, from in the early 20th century. This is a before and after picture. On the left is after treatment, and on the right is before treatment. So because you don't have active bacillus in the patients that are alive today, you don't really see the kinds of deformity that you see on the right with the active, the kind of tubercular pustules that are usually associated with Hansen's disease. So these are some other pictures from early 20th century Korea. The bottom picture is a very interesting picture. Dr. R.M. Wilson operating on a child who was gored by a wild boar. And he has his intestines hanging out, kind of. And then there's milk biggie and then some children hanging out on the street. Very interesting collection of pictures at the Yeosu Aeyangwon Museum, which is it's a museum that's actually housed in the original hospital that was built by R.M. Wilson, and the current hospital is to the side of that original building, and the original building is now a museum. So if you're in Yeosu, I highly recommend checking it out. Some really interesting archival pictures. So I'm going to start introducing some characters, and these characters are kind of representing different kind of movements and worldviews, and also different means of treatment. Missionary Wiley Forsythe is a very symbolic missionary and a very symbolic character in Hansen's disease in Korea. He was a Scottish missionary. He came to Korea in 1904, and there's a very kind of apocryphal tale about him that in 1909 he meets this leprosy sufferer woman on the side of the road, and she's being stoned in some accounts by the villagers. Anyway, she's near death. So he puts her on his horse and he takes her to Gwangju, where R.M. Wilson was running a hospital at the time. And at Gwangju she gets treatment, and they needed somewhere to put her, but they couldn't treat her in the actual hospital. So in the bottom picture is R.M. Wilson standing next to a brick kiln and that was the brick kiln in which they first housed the first leprosy patient. And at that time, the Japanese government had not really started to deal with the idea of leprosy in Korea, that is. And neither had the missionaries. So that was the first kind of initiation of the project on leprosy in Korea by the missionaries. And it also has a very strong symbolic significance. It's called like the tale of the Good Samaritan foresight, or Good Samaritan foresight in the missionary jargon. So it's a very strong symbolic tale dealing with missionaries in Korea, and it really kind of was a strong, say, propaganda tool for the missionaries, even to this day. Here's Matt Damon playing R.M. Wilson. As a young picture, he came to Korea when he was 27. He was born in 1880, and he was a very interesting figure. He is a very much a social architect. And he was really also an ingenious surgeon. There was a lot of, he had a very surgeon personality, and he really liked problem solving and just trying to solve things with a knife that at the time were, very difficult to solve. He established, the first leprosarium was established in Gwangju in 1910. And it was later moved to Yeosu when the patients swelled to over 1,000. So, the Aeyangwon, which is also called the Wilson Leprosy Center, its highest leprosy population was about 1,100 patients, and they moved to Yeosu in around 1928. R.M. Wilson left Korea at 1941. And he actually came back in 1946 at the behest of General MacArthur when they were trying to solve when the American administration was trying to round up all the Hansen's disease patients who had escaped at the end of the war. These are some pictures. This is a house in Gwangju, the Wilson House. It's kind of a tourist attraction now. Those are on the far right is my mother's father, and then his two younger brothers, and they're at the museum at Sorokdo, and in the back is a picture of their father. All three of them became doctors, and on the bottom is the current Wonjang, the director of Aeyangwon, with Johnny Wilson, who's in the other picture. They came back to Korea for the first time. For some of them, in my grandfather's case, it was the first time in some 70 years or something. They're all in their 90s. So they came back 2 years ago for the centennial celebration of Aeyangwon Hospital. I wasn't able to make it at that time, but I got to spend more time later on. So, stigma and otherization. So, leprosy in Korea traditionally it existed at endemic levels, and for leprosy that means about 0.5% of the population. So there are about 100,000 to 150,000 leprosy sufferers in the 1940s and 50s, according to some estimates. And there are currently about 15,000 registered recovered patients, no active bacteria in their bodies. So about 10% of the original population is still alive. Some of them are, of course, younger, but the average age is probably above 60. Leprosy sufferers, this was a very interesting point argued by our professor Keun-Shik, and it's important to point out that leprosy sufferers constitute the primary social other in modern Korean society. Korea is often thought of as ethnically homogeneous, and so it's interesting to note that these people who are kind of marginalized really almost constituted, they're almost thought of as another ethnicity. They're really treated as a social other. And even within their own kind of jargon, they speak about the Hansens disease family as if they're kind of and that's a result of their isolation. And to this day, they live in somewhat isolated communities to a large extent due to kind of learned isolation. And leprosy sufferers, as you can see in these two pictures, they were often condemned to begging and wandering, lives of begging and wandering. And that is the kind of quintessential picture of leprosy in Korea, is a wandering, begging person. And there's folk tales that they would eat the liver of children to recover their health. And so they were used as kind of a boogeyman, kind of a real boogeyman figure in pre-modern Korea. And these are some pictures of people who had come to the hospital and were trying to gain admission. They would walk from all over Korea and make their way to the hospital and try to get entry and treatment. So one of my big questions is what was R.M. Wilson's kind of model of treatment, and also how did that compare to the Japanese government model of treatment, the state model of treatment? Here you can see him in the surgery room. There's actually a big tumor on the abdomen of a patient. So it's a really interesting shot. He really liked challenging surgeries. I think it's a very interesting aspect of him. He really liked bizarre surgeries that nobody had ever done before. So, but he was also a social architect. He encouraged vocational training for all the patients and gardening skills and self-sufficiency. He wanted to convert them from beggars to self-sufficient workers. And so he encouraged work as part of their regimen. That's next to the right of the picture of R.M. Wilson is carpentry workshop with patients working in carpentry. Below that is a cobbler making shoes. It doesn't appear that person is a patient, but he also did have other workshops in cobblery and other trades that the patients were taught. In the bottom left is a picture of the original hospital, which is still standing today at the museum. So this was his idea of patient treatment. I have another slide that kind of explains that better. This is a comparison shot of, in the bottom is the village that was built by the patients at Yeosu, and the top is a kind of shanty town that the patients were living in before. These were the people that kind of couldn't get into a leprosy settlement and were more or less homeless. I'll explain this this village in a moment. It exists on a peninsula in Yeosu, and there's still a large. The village is still there. Albeit it doesn't look like this, but there is still one old lady living in one of these houses. And then there are some abandoned houses that are still standing, but the rest of the village has moved into more modern housing. But it's still very poor, and they're mostly pig farmers and chicken farmers. Missionary model of treatment. So Wilson's idea of treatment really centered on a couple of things. At the time, there was no modern antibiotics that were effective against leprosy. So quarantine and treatment by chamuger oil injection. Chamuger oil is an oil that was it was a Vedic treatment from Indian medicine that they used on leprosy, and he was convinced that it worked, but not everybody was convinced that it worked. And vocational training and self-sustenance, and life in the church. Life is life centered around the church. He set up segregation of genders, and at some point he began a program of marriage for patients. And it was a program of marriage, vasectomy, and adoption. So marriage was contingent on consent to vasectomy. The males would have to be sterilized before they could get married. But to assuage their desires for children, they would be able to adopt orphans or children with leprosy. So it's a very interesting. This policy is usually associated with the Japanese government, and I still have some questions about how exactly this policy was developed. It was later adopted by the Japanese government leprosy colony, but it was first instituted in the missionary colonies, which is not something that you'll hear. It's not the kind of standard discourse on the subject. Usually people associate vasectomy with some of the crimes of the Japanese regime, but they neglect to point out that it was first instituted by missionaries. And it took on kind of eugenic aspect, ideological aspect, under the Japanese state leprosarium, preventing leprosy patients from reproducing, not because leprosy was thought to be genetically inherited, but to prevent a kind of class of people that the leprosy patients were thought to represent. And so I think it's important to keep in mind the complexities. That's something I always try to do. Wilson definitely supported this, supported segregation, supported isolation and quarantine of leprosy, and he supported the marriage program. And he believed that many people were very happy with adopted children and life of marriage under the church. Maybe some people were, but others were definitely not. A word on quarantine. Quarantine is definitely not effective for leprosy, but that due to a lot of factors, which I probably don't have time to talk about, but it's definitely not effective treatment for leprosy. But he arguably didn't have the information to know that at the time. Here's a map of the peninsula of Yeosu, Aeyangwon. This is the peninsula where the church or the international mission to lepers helped buy this peninsula along with some affluent Korean donors. They bought the peninsula and set up a hospital on this peninsula. The current hospital is oh wow, you guys see that? Yeah. Okay, so the current hospital is right here, and this is the shape of the peninsula has somewhat changed because they did some land reclamation. But this is the original. This is a map, more of a concept map of the original peninsula. And one side was for men and one side was for women. So it was set up as kind of segregated from the beginning by genders. The original hospital is around, say, I believe it's right here, and so then the new hospital is right over here. Yeah. And of course, all the people still living in this village. You see the sprawl of this village. They're mostly doing pig farms, and they're mostly the descendants or former leprosy patients themselves.
Where were the colony homes?
If you can imagine, like these are the original villages, right? And I think they kind of, like this is the original concept map, I think they ended up going like this around the peninsula. So they would be like here and here. So I know that this is the women's side, so because the grandma is living like right here. So the rise of the state model leprosy colony. So I want to contrast the state model leprosy colony with the missionary model, and I guess the important distinction is that, well, just to give you an idea, the state leprosy colony, once it took off, almost never released people due to recovery. Wilson had a policy that people would be released once they were deemed free of leprosy, but the state leprosy colony almost never did that. And it was really more of an asylum, more of an Alcatraz for leprosy patients. It was established in 1916, but it didn't really take off until 1933 when this Dr. Suho Masasue, a Japanese doctor, took over as director. And he was a very energetic young visionary and up-and-coming young officer, sanitary officer. And he was from out of Kyoto Medical School, very kind of elite Japanese doctor. And I think it's interesting to contrast him and Dr. Wilson. They met each other at least once. The top picture here is Suho is marked by an X, and this was a picture in the property of my great grandmother, and she had written on the back, the man marked by the X was stabbed by an inmate, and that was referring to his assassination in 1942 by a leprosy patient, which we'll get to in a minute. But he was really pushing for the development of this leprosy colony as an international leprosy colony, and leprosy colonies in themselves, you start to realize that at the time they were a model of modernity. They were a model of civilized modern society, and that the existence of these wandering bands of begging leprosy patients were a symbol of backwardsness. So the Japanese very much wanted to exterminate the backwardness in their colony and pull it into the 20th century as a modern imperial power. That was very much the thrust of their policy on leprosy. The original, and they saw that America, which had a colony in the Philippines, also had a leprosy colony there. And the Japanese were envious of the benevolent kind of light, the benevolent image that the American colony had, that the Americans had towards their colonial subjects. And they wanted to be a modern, benevolent nation, benevolent imperial nation. So they very much promoted this leprosy colony as a means of soft power, as a means of showing that they were there to help the Koreans advance into the 20th century. And Suho was also kind of promoted as a saint. There was a statue built of him, kind of a famous incident in which he had a statue built of himself, which the patients bowed to every day. And the patients largely, many of them were converted Christians, and they really objected to this. And that was one of the things that actually eventually got him killed. He also garnished the wages of various patients, of all the patients, in order to build the statue. So the maximum holding capacity of Sorokdo peaked at 6,000 patients around World War II. Today, about 560-some patients are living there today. I'm currently staying on Sorokdo on a volunteer program. it's a really great place, but it's still in kind of de facto isolation. If you go there as a tourist, you're not allowed to go into the villages, which is understandable. But it's interesting that even though there's no enforced isolation or say de jure isolation of leprosy in Korea today, there's a lot of de facto isolation in the various villages. And let's see, so I want to point out that Sorokdo at its peak held 6,000 patients. Aeyangwon at its peak held 1,000 patients, and there were around 100,000 patients, leprosy patients in Korea. So there was never successful isolation of leprosy in Korea. They might have isolated the worst cases, but they might have successfully kind of targeted the worst cases or the most apparent populations, the most visible populations, but they were never able to actually enforce their policy of quarantine, which aspired to envelop all the leprosy in the entire country. This is a map of Sorokdo National Hospital. The bridge was constructed in 2009 with some controversy. Across the bridge is Nokdong. Is down in Jeollanamdo, and it was interesting that there was some controversy over building the bridge in 2009 because a lot of people, wouldn't want their town to have a bridge connecting it to the leprosy colony. Some people said it was because they didn't want all the tourist influx, but you can see the little red cross here is the national hospital, and there were 4 main villages. There was also isolation between the villages here as a means of preventing organization among the patients. For example, if they had a batch of, say, like political patients that were trying to agitate, then they would spread them out among the villages, and they limited access between the villages. This is Han Ha-un, the poet Han Ha-un, 1920 to 1975. He was a very interesting figure, originally from North Korea. I'm going to skip over that right now. Hansen's disease literature. Han Ha-un is definitely the signature Hansen's disease poet. He inspired the poet Goun when Goun was a teenager, and he's kind of the most famous Hansen's disease patient in Korea, probably to this day. And he expressed a lot about a lot of different aspects of the life of Korean leprosy patients. This is a poem about the political participation of Hansen's disease patients and how they're excluded from the political realm. Hansen's disease literature. This is so Lee Sung-min. I think it's Lee Sung-min. Was published. He was writing an autobiography, and he was actually the son of a major donor to Aeyangwon Hospital, and he happened to contract leprosy, and he was admitted to Aeyangwon Hospital, and he lived there until 1951. His autobiography is one of the main evidences of kind of abuse of power by church elders at Aeyangwon, and so it's pretty important, but it was never widely received. He was banished to Sorokdo in 1951, along with a group of, I think, 43 other people for being accused communists. This was this was after the Yeosu Tsuncheon rebellions, so there's a lot of anti-communist red baiting going on in that particular region. He was accused of being a communist and shipped to Sorokdo. One of the things that you find at Aeyangwon is that a lot of the people who were to be punished there were just shipped to Sorokdo because it was understood that Sorokdo was so much worse that that was punishment enough. He died in 1960, and unlike Han Ha-un, he was a friend of Han Ha-un, but he never received, he was never able to get literary acclaim, and he was never able to publish the last volume of his trilogy, and even the first 2 volumes of his trilogy were never widely received. They're very hard to find. I still haven't read them, but I'm planning on it. Lee Cheong-jun also published 당신들의 천국. This is one of the main literary works on leprosy. And it's very interesting because it depicts Sorokdo as a microcosm of Korean society, which I think is a very apt argument. It's a very interesting book if you get the chance to check it out. Human rights violations concerning Hansen's disease. The main ones are listed here: forced labor, forced vasectomy, mobilization, and quarantine. And I added life under religious hegemony. It's interesting to note that people in Sorokdo lived under religious hegemony under Shintoism, and most of them were Christian. But they also lived under religious hegemony at Aeyangwon because there was no life outside the church. There was no opportunity for participation in political life outside of the church, and even baptism was used as a kind of political tool to separate those who were accepted and those who were not. So you had to apply for baptism, and until you had achieved baptism, you were not considered a real member of society, of that society. And red baiting and crushing of protests. So I'm going to explain what these are. This is a non-exhaustive list, but a list of some of the main incidents of rebellion and demonstrations by Hansen's disease patients. In 1933, there was an arson at Aeyangwon Church, and four people were indicated in that arson, and 1 committed suicide and 3 were shipped to Sorokdo. I think that it's an important incident, even though we don't have the accounts of the actual people. But it's an important incident to show that there were different factions. And the arson, I think, is best seen as kind of a reaction against the church elders. Not even the missionaries, but the church elders who were also patients themselves, who had kind of a political monopoly within that, within the leprosarium. 1941, Dr. Suho's assistant was assassinated on Sorokdo, and the next year, that was shortly after one of the first national conferences on leprosy at Sorokdo, and that was the conference at which Suho met Wilson, and the man who was assassinated, Park Soon-ju, was actually received merits from the Japanese government for his service of the patients, of Hansen's disease patients. And shortly after, he was assassinated by a disgruntled patient who was angry that this man was getting credit because he was a crony of Dr. Suho. The next year, Suho was assassinated by Lee Chung-san with a kitchen knife. 1945, there was a period of intense deprivation and also violence and political upheaval during the war at during World War II, and Sorokdo lost about 30% of its population in about 2 years towards the end of the war, as Japan, both from starvation, some people fled the island, a lot were killed in instances of violence, and in 1945, at liberation, there was a lot of agitation for kind of for self-governance of Sorokdo Island, and that culminated in the massacre of 84 inmates by the kind of transition Korean government, and the next year Wilson took over again as Wonjamin director in 1946, but he only stayed for a couple months, and it was handed back over to the Koreans fairly soon after that. 1951, 43 political activists were exiled from Aeyangwon to Sorokdo, including Lee Sung-min, the author. Leprosy in Korea today. So just some statistics showing, like, talking about people living with leprosy, or living, people affected by leprosy in Korea today. Under 15,000 people are registered as recovered leprosy patients, and about 11,000 of those are registered as disabled. 332 are active patients. I'm not sure exactly what that means. It probably means that they might have some bacteria left in their body, or they're still receiving antibiotics. Less than 10 new cases each year, but most of these are, like in other first world countries, are cases of immigration and perhaps relapse cases. 5,000 live in agricultural settlements, and about 1,300 are living in institutions like assisted living institutions and things like that. And then the rest, of course, are just in general society. Just a couple of years ago, there was a claim won against the Japanese government. It's kind of similar to the Comfort Women claim. A group of Japanese lawyers and Korean lawyers sued the Japanese government for compensation for wartime abuses, and they were compensated. 526 patients, living patients, won compensation from the Japanese government. 5,500 patients have filed claims for damages from the Korean government, post-liberation damages, and this is kind of ongoing, but it's not going very well for them. 1,000 cases are called confirmed human rights violations cases. So they've been recognized as cases of human rights violations, but they have not won particular special compensation for beyond medical treatment. Of course, a lot of these people are receiving basic welfare from the Korean government, but it's not special welfare for Hansen's disease patients beyond the medical stipend that they receive. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. I think we have a period for questions. Yeah. Yes.
Well, you were talking about the civil suits against the Japanese government and the Korean government. But at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah, it's the same.
Can you talk a bit about that? What are the goals of the commission?
Yeah, it's basically the same thing. It's a group of lawyers and activists that are just trying to get both formal apologies as well as monetary compensation from those governments. So the case with Japan is largely settled. Largely considered settled. There's not much going on with that, but the current case is with the Korean government. And of course, there's many more living cases that were affected by the Korean government just because of the generation. So yeah, they're
Is it modeled after the South African Truth and Reconciliation?
I mean, that's definitely what it's named after, but I don't think it's modeled after that in any meaningful sense.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You get an apology from the Japanese government?
Yeah, along with.
They did apologize?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact wording of the apology. So maybe it was an apology. I haven't read the statement that went with the suit, but they get monetary compensation. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned the social otherization historically, but what about in today's society?
In today's society? Yeah, so an interesting case was in the 1990s, around 1995. And it was at a Hansen's disease village. And there was a case of 4 missing children, 4 missing boys. And the police got a tip that the Hansen's disease patients might have something to do with the disappearance and kidnapping. And so they actually went ahead and investigated the whole village. And of course it turned out that it's just a rumor based on the folktale about Hansen's disease patients and eating children. But it kind of shows you that these kind of rumors die hard. A lot of people of that generation who you talk to today still think that Hansen's disease patients really ate children, because they have these memories of being children and being so afraid of these wandering beggars. So I think you still have reverberances in modern society, definitely. As well as in Japan, there's some instances that come up in the news of kind of discrimination and things like that. But yes, yeah. I of course, it'd be really hard to get married as a child of a Hansen's disease patient in certain sectors of Korean society, as you can imagine. So just kind of general baseline discrimination is, yeah.
You mentioned about the de facto isolation of the lepers, and also about the people coming in as tourists, they weren't allowed there.
Right.
What about the lepers being, or the Hansen patients being able to travel or whatever, wander the country now?
Yeah, right. So they're definitely, so there's no restrictions on their movement, right?
They're not quarantined.
No, there's no ongoing quarantine.
Right.
But what you have is kind of a socialized self-isolation, and also, which is understandable. You have people who are completely institutionalized. They entered the institution in their teens, and then they lived there, for a long time, and now they're more comfortable around other Hansen's disease patients. So that's an interesting factor of social otherization, is that they really internalize the otherization. Yeah.
Throughout your presentation, I couldn't help thinking about the similar kind of parallel models of tuberculosis treatment, also in Suncheon, Gwangju area, also by Christian missionary families like the Hansen family.
Sure.
And how I have a lot of kind of questions related to comparing those. How does the treatment model of tuberculosis in that area by those? I think they were the same. They were both in Southern Presbyterian.
Yeah. They were both with the same church. I haven't actually looked into that. It's definitely something that I'd be very interested to expand into. But I've really been focused on these couple hospitals that were Hansen's disease hospitals. So yeah, it's a very good question.
Yeah. Just thinking about that, did the Japanese authorities see these American missionaries as a useful allies in helping modernize?
So I think there were two basic kind of views from the Japanese perspective. One was Dr. Wilson. Actually, he had accolades from the Japanese Empress Dowager, and he received a lot of monetary assistance as well as medals of honor from her and also other Japanese government officials. So there was a lot of course, collaboration between Wilson and the Japanese government, and of course other missionaries as well. But there was also sectors of the Japanese government who definitely saw the missionaries as a threat, like I was talking about, the kind of benevolent government image. And so it's a kind of political good, right? Medicine is a political good, and it's and so the Japanese, if the Japanese don't have monopoly on medicine in their colony, they're losing. They don't have a monopoly on the political good, which they're offering to their subjects. So that was kind of the goal of Sorokdo, was to phase out all the missionary hospitals and have one national leprosarium. And they would set up similar leprosariums as they expanded their empire. That was their goal. They had a kind of blueprint for expansion into the Pacific and things like that. But it never got that far, of course. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.